Hello and welcome to the Five Leaves interview with Jon McGregor. I'm Deirdre O'Byrne of Five Leaves Bookshop. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Jon to our Five Leaves author series, as he was the very first customer in Five Leaves Bookshop when it opened in 2013. But of course, that is not his main claim to fame. He's produced many acclaimed works of fiction. And tonight, we're happy to help the Nottingham launch of Lean Fall Stand. So this is the way the event will run. First of all, we'll have a clip of Jon coming from Bromley House in Nottingham. And then I'll interview him for about 30 or 40 minutes. If you have questions for Jon, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll attend to them.
Good evening. My name is Jon McGregor. I'm here in the Bromley House Library in the heart of Nottingham, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my new novel, Lean Fall Stand, before we go into the conversation with Deirdre. So this novel started in 2004, so 17 years ago, when I went on a writing residency to Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey, supported by the Arts Council England, and I went and spent 4 or 5 weeks on a ship travelling down to the Antarctic Peninsula. Here's a picture of me on that ship, all kitted out. This is me at the end of my journey, but let me just take you back a little bit, back to the beginning. This is a couple of weeks into the journey when we saw our first icebergs, and this was tremendously exciting for me. I'd obviously never seen icebergs before. I'd been on the ship for a number of weeks, and there were the icebergs in the distance. And the trip went on like that. We saw icebergs, we went to South Georgia, we went to a small island called Port Lockroy, which has the world's southernmost post office. And we were headed for Antarctica itself, for the Antarctic Peninsula. And let me show you a picture of how close I got to there. Okay, this is a picture of, in the far distance, the Antarctic base of Reservoir. You can just see the mountains on the horizon, hopefully. And you can see, leading away from the ship, the what's called the lead of ice, the kind of brashy water. The ship's just been forwards into that ice and it's come back again, and it's basically kind of ramming backwards and forwards, trying to carve its way through the ice. And in the end, the ship didn't get there. The ship didn't manage to get through the ice. I spent 5 weeks on the ship waiting to get to Antarctica and came home, came back to the Falklands and flew home to England. And that was a very strange experience because it had been the most exciting trip I'd ever been on, and kind of the most disappointing trip I'd ever been on because we never actually made it. And it was very difficult to talk to anyone about that disappointment because obviously that sounded a bit gratuitous to kind of think of that as disappointing when I'd seen icebergs and mountains and Shackleton's grave in South Georgia and all sorts of amazing things. But it was disappointing and it was strange. And I came back here to Bromley House Library and did a lot of reading of Antarctic literature. I read there's some amazing books in this library, as you probably know, but Shackleton's Last Voyage, incredible book, one of the lesser known books by Richard E. Byrd called Alone, where he almost dies, and he's got this great line in this book, says, I hadn't realised how close a man could come to dying and still want to live, which I thought was incredible and kind of stayed with me. Most of the classics of Antarctic literature are about men nearly dying. That's the kind of the common theme. But I've been on this residency and people had spent a lot of money getting me almost to Antarctica, and there was definitely an understanding that I was going to come back and write a novel about it. And I didn't do that for 17 years. And I feel like I owe people an explanation. And part of the explanation is that I found it really difficult to put that experience into words. I found the things that I'd seen really difficult to make sense of and to kind of communicate. And the image of an iceberg that I showed you just now, in fact, let me show you another image of an iceberg. So this is on our way back to the Falklands, somewhere around the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, and you can see in this image the kind of sheet ice and the brash ice in the distance, ice sheet at the edge of the continent, and the mountains in the background. And it's much easier to point you at this picture and say, look at that, look how amazing, incredible, beautiful that is, than to write pages and pages of description that try and kind of put that image in your mind. And a lot of the early Antarctic literature does exactly that. I mean, you can see how thick these books are. It's because they spend pages and pages and pages trying to explain what an iceberg looks like, or what a moraine looks like, or what a glacier is. And it's quite dense reading, and it's not always that successful, I think. And so I got stuck for a long time thinking about language and words, and what language is for, what it achieves, what it doesn't achieve. And I wrote some other books in the meantime, but all the time I was thinking about what language can and can't do. And I kind of stumbled upon, in thinking about this, I stumbled on the existence of a condition called aphasia, which affects people who've had some kind of brain injury, often a stroke. And it's a loss of language in some form. It's a loss of the ability to process language, or to understand it, or to express it. It affects some people's writing, or their reading, or their speaking, or their listening, or some combination of those four areas. And clearly it's incredibly debilitating for people, and has a really significant impact on their life. And I got really interested in this. I don't really know why, other than I found it quite frightening. I found the idea of it quite frightening, and therefore intriguing. And the more I learn about how people who live with aphasia develop communication strategies and skills, and sometimes rebuild parts of their language, and other times just find other ways of communicating, the more interested I got. And I've read some work by people with aphasia, and was really struck by the process and techniques for kind of working around language, and building something, in some cases, quite exhilarating with their language. And I felt a real affinity with that. And so the book became about language and communication, and what happens when somebody loses language. And so I did a lot of research on that in Nottingham. I spoke to speech and language therapists locally. I went to the city hospital, spent some time on the stroke ward. I went to an aphasia self-help group locally, and spent time with people there, kind of just getting to know them and learning about how they worked on their communication, and how they worked around their communication difficulties. And all the time I was trying to write a novel using words about a loss of language. I was trying to use language to express the absence of language, and that was kind of difficult, and it was kind of challenging. And I realised at some point that by trying to resolve the challenge of writing about Antarctica, I'd simply given myself a whole new challenge. And for much of the process I felt like this, like I was lost in the fog, couldn't really see where I was going, was trying to get somewhere. But I got there in the end, and here it is. This is my new novel, Lean Full Stand, which took quite a lot to write. It took a lot of time, a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to people, and I'm kind of excited about it, and I hope people enjoy reading it. It starts in Antarctica, where I started. It starts with a storm and a disaster, with adventure, terror, and kind of, it's something that's new for me, with some kind of suspense and narrative excitement. And then it comes home to Cambridge, to the main character's wife, a woman called Anna, who gets thrown into a caring role that she wasn't expecting, she wasn't really ready for. She doesn't even necessarily welcome, but she has to just get on with. And it follows the main character and his wife as they search for kind of ways out, for routes to some kind of recovery, or some kind of acceptance or adaptation to new ways of living with their brains, their new brains and bodies, and their search for the right words. So I'm just going to finish here with a short reading from the beginning of the book, and then move into conversation. So this is from the very beginning. They're in Antarctica, they're in the middle of a storm, and all hell is breaking loose. He shouldn't have put down the radio. He shouldn't have moved away from Luke. He shouldn't have agreed with Doc's idea about climbing Priestley Head just for the sake of a photograph. He'd let himself get distracted by the scenery. Doc kept pretending to be blasé about it, but it was hard not to just stop and stare. All that ice and snow and sea and sky. Glaciers and ridges and icebergs and scree, weathering and windform and sheer. The air so clear that distances shrank and all the colours shone. The wind was still roaring around him. The cold was starting to seep through his clothes. He thought he could hear the crackle of the radio, but he couldn't be sure. The wind was still raw in his ears. He reared up on his knees and reached out into the blasting snow. "Come in. Come in. Thomas, come in." It was Luke, barely. It seemed odd to hear him on the radio when he was so nearby. He listened and heard Luke's voice again. There were no clear words, but he recognised the tone. He turned until he was facing the sound. The wind was hitting him to the left. He crouched very still and listened, but he could only hear the wind. Being down on the ice like this was a mistake. Keep dry, remain calm, stay in place, keep dry. He eased to his feet, keeping his body low. The gusts came and went and he was knocked around, buffeted. He took 2 steps with his hands held out in front of him. The snow blasted against his back. He heard Luke's voice again. It was behind him now. Something shifted in the quality of the sound, and he saw open water at his feet, roiling grey against the whiteness. Something was wrong. The water should have been behind him. He backed away. He was definitely starting to feel the cold. He looked at the grey water and he concentrated. The wind was dropping slightly, but it was still hitting the left side of his face. The wind must have changed direction. He turned through 180 degrees, slowly. He edged forwards with his hands held out. He heard the radio again, and again he scrabbled around at his feet. Luke's voice was shrill and distant. There were breaks in the transmission. "Doc, Thomas, come in. Come in, Doc, anyone?" There would be food at the skidoo when he found Luke. The dark grey water sloshed against the edge of the ice. The weather was thick and he could barely stand upright. He felt dizzy, unsteady, almost seasick. Something was wrong.
Thanks very much, John. I can't see you on the screen. Do you need to turn on your video? Here you are.
I was waiting for the dramatic entrance, Deirdre. Hi. Hi.
Yeah, that was wonderful. It's a terrific story, isn't it? I mean, how not getting there becomes more exciting than, well, I suppose. I mean, how do you know if you had got there? But it does seem like a metaphor for how stuck you were for a long time with the book. And I was very interested in how you represent the difficulties of language. Like Anna, for instance, she doesn't get jokes and quite often she doesn't understand metaphors. I really liked her friend Bridget telling her what to do with a wine bottle. I mean, there's lots of funny bits in the book. But even before the stroke, Doc doesn't seem to know that his young colleagues are winding him up, and he sometimes uses language oddly. You must have had a lot of fun thinking about the different ways that we get stuck with language.
Yeah, I did, and it was kind of a circular thing, because I think I became interested in aphasia as a condition and as a theme for the book because I was interested in the difficulties of language and the ways that language can fail us and was failing me in trying to write the book. And once that was my theme, then I was thinking about that in a wider sense and the ways in which all of us struggle with language in various ways. And actually, once I started thinking about it, that's always been something that I've written about. That kind of crops up in all of my previous work. People who are not quite saying what they mean clearly enough to each other. People who misunderstand each other. People who fail to kind of express themselves. And so those kind of before the stroke, before aphasia becomes the kind of dominant feature of Doc and Anna's life. There's all these other, like as you said, there are all these other kind of problems with language and miscommunication, which I think all of us experience constantly anyway.
Yeah, I think the way it starts with cracking ice floes and breaking radio transmission, it really leads very nicely into those kind of cracks in communication. You spoke about the research you did for Lean Falls Stand, and I mean, you can tell from all your novels that they're meticulously researched. Like, I get very annoyed by things about the Irish diaspora when they get them wrong as I perceive it, but like, it's so many ways to begin, I thought was spot on. Do you enjoy this really meticulous, careful research process?
I enjoy people thinking that I've gone through a meticulous research process. I always panic a bit. I feel like I'm not doing as much research as kind of serious novelists would do, and I'm certainly doing less research than I would if I was writing a non-fiction book about these subjects. I think I kind of naturally put off the research that I need to do until quite late in the process. So by the time I come to the research, I've developed my ideas for characters and story, and I think in a way, I mean, I'm kind of making excuses for myself, but in a way that helps because I'm not kind of borrowing stories that I hear during the research process. But a lot of my research gets done really at the end when I have enough time to show early drafts to people who know their stuff, who will then kind of correct me on because it's the little details that would put people off who know their stuff. And I'm kind of, I'm waiting. I'm probably going to be told things about this book by people who live with aphasia or people who work in that field. I'm sure there are things I've still kind of let slip through the net, but I did spend a lot of time talking to speech and language therapists and people on the stroke wards at City Hospital, and to spend time with a self-help group in Nottingham. So I was kind of feeling my way into the area kind of quite gradually. But meticulous is probably putting it too strong.
But I could see how that works, that by the time you do the research, you know what it is you're looking for. But it works. I really liked the politics behind your depiction of the care system, that carers are getting 14 to 30 minutes. And I mean, I know a little bit about the care system. That is spot on. But the resources are stretched. Speech therapy is really limited in its provision. And I mean, I was struck by Anna saying, care in the community, it's down to her. It's she says, it's just me. It seems to make a particularly important point at the moment when we're all thinking about the NHS.
Yeah, and it was. I didn't want to kind of. I never want my novels to kind of turn into political kind of messages, but it's very difficult to write about health and about care without kind of being aware of some of the limitations and some of the difficulties in the system as it functions at the moment, and the way that the carers, the unpaid carers, family members are kind of taken for granted by the system and relied on by the system is really something that I feel quite strongly about, and that idea, it gets called care in the community, as if as if we live in kind of incredibly integrated kind of village type communities where everybody's in and out of each other's houses all the time helping out, and actually community usually means the one person that person lives with, and people are put under tremendous pressure. And all the stuff about resources being cut for the last 10, 12 years, until there's people can barely remember what a properly funded service used to look like, kind of accept how it's been degraded.
I think you're very good at embedding those political points. For instance, that Luke, because he's black filth, he won't be listened to, and the gendered quality of Doc just being the big fella going off to the Antarctic for several months of the year while somebody else is looking after his children who don't recognize him when he comes back. I mean, I know you've talked about this before, the fact that if you're a hero, it's because all these people are supporting you behind.
Yeah, and I was a lot of the reading that I did about Antarctica, and about the whole history of well, initially men going to Antarctica, the explorers, the cartographers, the people who kind of were establishing research bases. The gender issue really interested me, and men's kind of preoccupation with some of the men who were going there, their preoccupation that kind of really comes across in the literature with with being brave, with being heroic, with lots of references to virgin territory, untouched territory, and this idea that they're kind of being where no one else has been before, and really kind of interesting and questionable and problematic in lots of ways, and this idea that there's something kind of self-sufficient about going off to places like this, and it's kind of runs through any kind of explorer literature. Often men going to places as if they're being completely self-sufficient, and actually there's a whole kind of army of logistic support behind them, kind of keeping them there, keeping them alive, and coming in and rescuing them when it goes wrong. So I was really conscious of that. I'm really interested in that as a theme.
And whose stories matter. It's the white bloke, even if he's had a stroke, that they're interested in his story rather than Luke's or the wife or anybody else who was involved. That group you have where Robert he's being helped by dancers and they're doing movement. I thought that was terrific. Have you actually, how have you seen people using movement in this way to tell stories through body language, or where did your inspiration come from there?
Well, that came mostly from I went to see a performance a couple of years into my writing of the book by a group called Rosetta Life, and they did a performance called Stroke Odysseys, which was on the lakeside about 3 years ago. Although annoyingly, I missed getting a ticket for it, and I had to go and see it in Bristol, which was a bit daft. But that was a performance that came out of a process quite similar to the one that's described in the novel. So people, stroke survivors, working with dancers and choreographers and musicians to develop a kind of shared stage performance. It's a more kind of elaborate, developed performance than the one that's described in the novel. But going to see that and then kind of looking into their process, their development process, and watching lots of videos on their website about their process, informed a lot of that section of the book. As I was really interested in, one of the things I was reading about was, I think when I went into this research process, I kind of vaguely pictured aphasia being a condition from which you gradually recover. You have a stroke, and then you have limited mobility, limited speech, and you do a lot of physio and you learn to walk, and you do a lot of speech therapy and you learn to talk, and there's kind of that kind of nice kind of recovery, redemption trajectory that we know from movies. And actually, one of the things I learned very quickly was that when stroke damages the brain stays damaged, and there are lots of things that people can do to some extent kind of rewire the brain and relearn certain physical movements and certain parts of their communication, but a lot of that damage just stays damaged. And actually what people are doing in speech and language therapy is learning ways to adapt to to their new way of communicating, and lots of communication strategies. And it was one of the things that I experienced in the group that I went to, was just how many ways people can find around whatever particular kind of communication deficit they had. So gesture and tone of voice and pointing at pictures and using particular words. And it was really interesting and really powerful to see how effective those communication strategies could be. And that was one thing I became really interested in. The kind of the idea that it's not about recovery in the kind of get up out of your wheelchair kind of sense. It's about adaptation and learning to adapt to a new situation.
Yeah. I found lots of echoes of poetry, but maybe I was imagining it with T.S. Eliot. This is not what I meant at all. Prufrock is in there. Do you read poetry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I didn't think it had to be, but
yeah. I do. Yeah, I do read poetry. I probably don't read as much as a lot of people here this evening, but yeah, I think poetry is always. Okay, I hate to say poetry's informed my writing, but I just have said that. I'm interested in the same way that poets are interested in sound and meaning and rhythm and the look of words on the page. I'm interested in bringing those aspects into fiction, but in a kind of less accomplished way than poets, or a less kind of refined way than poetry does. I don't know, but I'm definitely interested.
But I could see how with Eliot the whole breakdown of language, but Jonathan Myers says in the Guardian review that you in your novels represent life as a steady diurnal traipse where characters go through hell and just keep going. So, Jon McGregor, are you turning into a cross between Thomas Hardy and Samuel Beckett?
Yeah, I think that wasn't meant as a compliment, but I kind of took it as a compliment. I think I've always been interested in how people keep going and how people cope and how people survive and adapt. And yeah, I kind of think like life isn't necessarily about dramatic changes in fortune and dramatic reversals in fortune, and sometimes the kind of the triumph in a life is to get through a difficult stage of your life and to kind of get through and adapt and so I took it as a compliment.
Yeah, I mean, you don't come up with easy resolutions or happy endings, but as I've said, there are funny bits in the novel, and there's a very humane story in there. And you're fairly explicit about the demands of Anna's job. I know you're working at the University of Nottingham. You seem to show a lot of sympathy, as you do for workers in the care system, for people with, like, she's getting these emails and for input about research projects, funding applications, and all the rest of it. I know it's a job she wants to do, but you do make it sound like quite heavy going as well.
Yeah, I think that. So I should be clear that that's not particularly drawn on personal experience. I'm enjoying my job at the university, and I have good colleagues, and it's not as fraught as that makes it sound. I think a lot of people in academia do have a real struggle with. Well, maybe struggle is too strong a word, but there are issues around research and research funding and the different priorities, the balance of priorities between teaching and researching, and the priorities of the research that you need to do versus the research that's going to get the funding that the university wants. And so I was kind of, I was playing with ideas around that, but mainly I was interested in how she was being kind of drawn away from her work. She loves her work, and she's always been inspired by the work that she does, but but she's being kind of held away from it by Robert's needs. You know, she's been kind of thrown into this role as a carer, and she's basically got no choice about that. And I think that was my kind of focus.
Yeah, the fact that she didn't sign up for it, and it has suited them quite well to be living separate lives for so long because she can concentrate on the job. Your work has been longlisted, shortlisted for several awards, and of course you've won lots of them. But recently you've been a judge for the Rathbones Folio Award. I loved that you chose Carmen Maria Machado's book In the Dream House. It's such a fantastic book. Mm-hmm. Does it make you a different judge, the fact that you've been judged so often for prizes yourself? Is that a weird experience?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I really noticed was when we did the shortlist announcement, and I've been on quite a few judging panels, and one thing I've noticed fairly consistently is that even with different judges and different kind of set of tastes and different experiences and backgrounds, coming up with a shortlist is fairly straightforward. Mm-hmm. And there's more or less of quite a consensus around a shortlist. Maybe there'll be like 12 books that are on the table, and we have to narrow that down to 8. But there's a kind of a fairly easy consensus and an agreement around here's a handful of the best books from this huge list that we read. Mm-hmm. And then when you get to picking a winner, it gets much more difficult and much more kind of complicated and frankly a little bit what's the word? There's not much in it. Like there's it's a bit arbitrary. Arbitrary is the word. And I remember when we did the shortlist announcement, and there were these 8 authors on the screen in the little Zoom boxes, and I suddenly remembered being on other shortlists and knowing that there's quite a significant amount of money dangling up in the air somewhere. And I was looking at each of these writers, and with our shortlist, quite a few of the writers were relatively new. Some of them were debut writers. 2 or 3 of them were poets, who, money is quite scarce in the poetry world. And I was just thinking, oh yeah, each of you would really like this money. And I know we're not supposed to talk about money in literature, and we're supposed, and the prize is like the honour and everything, but it's like the Folio Prize is £30,000, which is a ton of money. And I just kind of suddenly felt the weight of that responsibility, which was kind of unpleasant to kind of be thinking, yeah, well, I've got to pick one of you, and one of you is going to get 30. I would much rather share it out, to be honest, but that's not how these things work. But no, I in terms of the actual judging, I think it's the other way around, really. Being on a judging panel makes it easier being on a long list or a short list, because you have a bit of insight into there's very little that is kind of meaningfully objective about the process. It's a bunch of people in a room, and on one day they decide that one book is their favourite out of some other books, and we've all done that. We've all been in the pub and said, "Oh, this is my favourite book," and it doesn't. I don't know. It's not a kind of universally objective statement. I don't think it's some people's opinion.
Yeah, that question was suggested by Ross Bradshaw. 5 Leaves. I've been listening to the abridgment of the book on Lean Fall Standard, because I know the book quite well by now. I was listening thinking, oh, they left that bit out. And I was wondering, do you listen to those adaptations yourself? And what's that like? Because you've had lots of work on Radio 4. I mean, they have...
Yeah. Well, So the abridgment was interesting. I haven't been listening to it. It's about as excruciating as having to watch that video just now was. Most people don't like the sound of their own voice, and hearing somebody else read something you've written on the radio is kind of the same. But I was very kind of briefly involved in the abridgment process in terms of seeing what they've done and kind of tweaking a few things. It's quite a skill, abridgment, because it's about 40% of the full text is on the radio. So if anybody has heard the radio, then they still need to buy the book, because you're missing out on the full thing otherwise. But yeah, and again, when I wrote those stories for Radio 4 a couple of years ago, the Reservoir tapes, I couldn't quite bring myself to listen to them in full, because there's just something odd about it.
Yeah, well, I used to work in public libraries, and I can reassure you, it doesn't stop people buying the book. It makes them buy it or borrow it, because I definitely noticed. Because I always had Radio 4 on during those kind of adaptations, and when I was in the library, I'd notice if I heard something on the whatever slot it was on, people would then come in and start asking for it, and I'm sure they were going into bookshops as well, asking for it. We're going to go to the audience Q&A. I was just wondering, I have one last question. This is probably completely army one, but my copy of Lean Fall stands a cover recommendation from no less than Hilary Mantel. And I know you've been endorsed by Jarvis Cocker, who interviewed you recently. Are you becoming a bit of celebrity? Do you get recognized on the street? Do people recognize you?
Do people recognize me?
Yeah.
No. That's never. Oh, that has happened once, but only when I was on my way to a book event. I don't think that counts. No, the nice thing about literature is it's a tiny world. It's kind of it's very niche. So no, I'm not in any danger of getting recognised in the street. But no, I don't think I'm a celebrity. I think my publishers are very good at sending advanced copies out to people and encouraging them to read it and tell them if they like it. So yeah, it was amazing to get a quote from Hilary Mantel. That was quite the honour.
Well, you're being very modest, because I know those people will get tons and tons of books. Why would they choose to comment on yours and read? Well, I can tell.
I think because it's got a nice cover. I think.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks, John. It's a terrific read. I can strongly recommend it to the people out there. So let's see what you've got in the Q&A. I've noticed some comments in there. Could you please put them in the Q&A box, because they've disappeared up the screen? I think Simon's already. Well, John, you were going to do a short reading for us at the end of the Q&A, so we've got that to look forward to. Let's see what people are saying here. Anonymous. I loved Reservoir 13, but man, that was a bleak story. Should we expect a similar level of bleakness in Lean Fall Stand? More, less?
So, I thought there was quite a lot of humour in Reservoir 13, but not everybody saw that, and that's fine. There's probably a similar level of humour in this one, so you might. Hang on, I'm underselling it, aren't I? No, this is much funnier than Reservoir 13 was. And it's much pacier. That's true. I can say that without bragging. The pace is very different in this book. And writing those stories for Radio 4 a few years ago kind of introduced me to the idea of pace and suspense and tension, and the idea that it's nice to give the reader a reason to turn the page. So... yeah, even if the anonymous attendee doesn't find the jokes, then they will find more pace than they found in Reservoir 13.
I thought it was funny. Elaine says, you so accurately reflected the experience of a stroke that the language you used, the disorientation of cognitive thinking, really resonated with her. How did you do that so accurately?
Thank you, Elaine. That's really generous of you. I did a lot of meticulous research. I think I did a lot of reading about kind of technical reading about the actual kind of the medical kind of ins and outs of stroke and aphasia. I did a lot of kind of reading of memoirs and biographies of people who've who've had strokes or cared for people with strokes. I watched a lot of YouTube videos. There's a really significant number of people who have experienced stroke and aphasia and or care for them have made kind of diary type videos on YouTube, and made podcasts, and so all of that kind of stuff. And you can, if you kind of look for enough of that stuff, it kind of accumulates, and it kind of accumulates into a kind of familiarity. And then, writing is about trial and error and trying stuff out. And if it doesn't feel right, you try something different, and you keep going until you feel that you've got something that is a kind of a shorthand for the reality.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Jane asks, Jane asks, what inspired you to apply to be a writer in residence in the Antarctic?
Yeah, it's a good question. There was an advert in the job section of The Guardian back when that was a thing, looking in job sections, and just for, it said writers and artists fellowships in Antarctica, and I just figured that sounded pretty cool. And I was of an age and a kind of irresponsibility where that was open to me. And so I applied for it. I mean, I think somebody asked me this recently if I'd always been interested in Antarctica, and I think I must have been without really being that conscious about it. I kind of grew up reading Swallows and Amazons and being interested in adventure stories and exploring, and was aware of Scott and Shackleton and all of that stuff. And just it was like seeing an advert in the paper saying, "Do you want to go to the moon?" Yes, I'll give that a go. It's so I applied, and got the place. So the at that time, the British Antarctic Survey for about 10 years had this scheme where every season they took a couple of writers or artists or musicians down to various parts of Antarctica. So there's quite a body of work that came out of that program. Mine's the last one, I should think.
Amazing. Sue says, are you aware of the poet Philip Gross's work on his father's loss of language in Deep Field and other collections?
I mean, I feel like I should be, Sue, but I'm afraid I'm not. But I'm writing it down. I spent several years working on this book, not being able to find very much about aphasia and language deficits in terms of creative work. And since this book's come out, people have been telling me lots of examples of creative work that deals with aphasia and language deficits. So I will look up Philip Gross. Thank you, Sue.
Kathy asks, would you be willing to give an example of where sound and cadence and poetic elements feed into your writing? She'd like to hear more about it.
I like an example of where that is in the book, or let me take another question, and I'll come back to Kathleen's question.
Well, Kathy might like to tell us more about. Celia, do you have a say in choosing the covers of your books, or do the publishers do that?
I get shown the cover and asked whether or not I like it, and there's a whole lot of diplomacy around how I deal with it if I don't like it. But I did like this one first time, so that was pretty straightforward. So yeah, I do have a bit of a say.
Jane says she remembers a quotation that says, "The Arctic doesn't give a damn about us. If it could have a preference, it would want us dead." She says the same probably applies to the Antarctic. Does this resonate with your book?
Yeah, that quote sounds familiar. I can't think who said it, but it does sound really familiar. And yeah, it absolutely applies to the Antarctic. I mean, that's one of the things that really comes across in lots of the writing about Antarctica. It's it's not a place that we are supposed to be. It's not designed to support human life at all. Anyone spending any time there is only there because of all of the kind of support facilities that have gone into sending people there. So no, it's a kind of merciless, perilous place, and and lots of people have died working there.
Yeah, I did that opening of the book where you're talking about Thomas's difficulty giving the picture perspective, because without someone in the frame, there was no way to capture the scale of this place. I mean, it just come across as really scary. And you've made me very scared of seals. John says, have you any reaction from the British Antarctic Survey, either officially or through any of the people on the journey with you?
I was talking to people during the writing process, and people saw a fairly recent draft. I haven't yet had a response from anybody who's read the published version, which I'm slightly nervous about what that response might be. Partly because, this is not a non-fiction book about the British Antarctic Survey. The organisation depicted in the book is definitely not the British Antarctic Survey, and yet, and so there are differences. There are differences between what happens in the book and what you would know if you work in Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey. And so I'm sure that people who work for them and have experienced life and work down there will see things in the book that don't tally with their experience. And that's because it's not supposed to be the British Antarctic Survey. But I can kind of anticipate people having, this might be where John turns out to work for Bass. I'm not sure.
Right, we're going to have to wrap up. So Selena says, can you talk about how you came to the title Lean, Fall, Stand?
Yes, I mean, not specifically, but it kind of bubbled up from the writing process at some point. As this often happens when I'm working on a novel, that at some point a kind of phrase from the text will just kind of jump out and feel like, oh, that could be the title. And once that happens, it kind of helps to kind of shape the theme and kind of tighten the theme and the structure of the book. And I think Doc says it when he's kind of self-commentating as he's going through, kind of as he's kind of the stroke is kind of building up. Effectively, he's kind of, things are kind of breaking down inside his brain, and he falls over and he gets up again and he kind of tells himself, lean, fall, stand, and it just struck me as quite a kind of interesting idea, and the kind of, it sets up three different acts for the novel, and it sets up the three kind of movements that the action has. So that's where it came from.
Well, thanks, John. You're going to leave us with a reading, but thank you very much. That's wonderful.
Okay, so I've picked the reading that you saw on the video from Bromley House. And by the way, thanks to Bromley House for letting us film in there. That was a lot of fun. That reading was from the very beginning of the book. This reading is from the beginning of the second section of the book. So at the beginning, we have Doc, Robert, in Antarctica, in a storm, things going badly. And then in the second section of the book, we move to his wife's perspective, Anna. She's been told that he's had a stroke, and she's been put on a plane to go to Santiago, to where Doc, her husband, has been evacuated. The flight attendants brought more meals, and the computer animation on the screen showed an aeroplane arcing over the Atlantic. She thought of how many times Robert had taken this same flight en route to Antarctica. She thought about him now in a hospital bed. A bit of a stroke. We need you to come. Other people would be panicking at this point, she imagined, or preparing themselves to grieve. She needed more information first. I'll update you as soon as I know. In the arrivals hall at Santiago, she saw a man holding a sign with her name written on. She recognised him from conferences at the Institute. He told her how sorry he was and that his name was Brian. He told her that everyone was rooting for Robert. She didn't know what this meant. She looked at him. He was holding a clipboard and had a pen attached to a long cord around his neck. We spoke on the phone, he said. I called you about Robert. Yes, she said. I know. They got into a taxi that smelled of cigarettes and deodorant. The traffic was slow and moved abruptly in confusing directions. There were tall buildings, pavement kiosks, people waiting at crossings. She kept seeing a mountain or a forested hill in the gaps between the buildings. Her phone kept buzzing. Brian was talking. It was too late to go to the hospital. The evacuation had gone as well as could be expected. There was some frostbite, but Brian didn't think they would amputate. He looked pleased. There were text messages from people who wanted to know things. She had no more information for them. The hotel was small, with a bar and restaurant in the lobby. Brian took care of the checking in and said he would be back in the morning. A young man called Andreas carried her suitcase to her room and told her about breakfast. Andreas was a German name, but he had grown up in the Czech Republic. She undressed and took a long shower. She didn't sleep. She read about stroke care pathways and recovery outcomes. She exchanged text messages with Bridget, who told her it was late and to get some sleep. From the window she could see a busy road, tall buildings, and clouds underlit by the glow of streetlights. When Brian had said it was too late to go to the hospital, he had meant too late in the evening, not too late. It wasn't too late, yet. She tried to sleep. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I think I'm the one saying goodbye, so thank you and goodbye.